So I have two wines for you. We tried with most to have an older wine and a younger wine, just because we all have histories. And speaking of histories, perhaps you'd like, see, that's me looking good now. Those are the flights we're going to have. And first flight, of course, is me. Speaking of histories, that's what I looked like when I started the wine business. And it's actually, I started the wine business maybe without knowing I was starting the wine business much earlier than that. I'm here because of one bottle of wine, which was a 1945 Chateauneuf de Pape. And it was sort of the wine that inspired my family to get into wine. So these first two wines I have are not 45 Chateauneuf de Pape, but one of them is a 2002 Monte Rosso, one of the great vineyards of California, 1,400 feet in elevation. The other one is one of the great vineyards of California. It's Old Hill Ranch. It's a mixed vineyard. Monte Rosso is almost 100% Zinfandel. Old Hill Ranch is probably 75% Zinfandel and 20 other grape varieties. It's a vineyard that goes way back to the 1860s and was replanted in 1885, so one of the first vineyards put on rootstock in California. Both made the same way. My winemaking is very simple. Both these wines were made in small open-top fermenters. The first one was actually made in a redwood fermenter. The second one was made in a stainless steel fermenter. Punched down by hand, native yeast fermentations, native mallows, and about 30% new French oak. So my winemaking, per se, hasn't changed much. The way I view winemaking, I don't believe has changed much, but I'm 40 years older than when I started. So like, the subtleties of not being able to actually see what has changed is there. So there may be subtle changes in my winemaking, but pretty much the same. So it's really what I believe to be good core winemaking, and that stems back to that 45 Chateauneuf de Pape. So my mother was a nuclear chemist who got bored when I was born. My parents met at a chemical honor society meeting. The chemistry was good, and I was the result. And my mother stayed home with me. And she got incredibly bored, so she decided to learn to cook. And in learning to cook, she read that the French drank wine with their meals. She'd grown up on a farm in Bolinas and had never had a bottle of wine in her life. But being my mother, she went to the city of Paris here in San Francisco and found a bottle of wine to go with Thanksgiving. The guy gave her a bottle of 1945 Chateauneuf de Pape. If he'd given her 44 or 43 or 46, I wouldn't be here today. But 45 was like the great vintage of France. And that bottle kind of turned my parents into wine drinkers. My father ultimately started a wine club. He taught me how to taste wine really early, when I was about 10. So I developed a love of wine very early. I, of course, was kind of the lost child for a long time. Ultimately ended up in medical research. But I ran into a guy named Joseph Swan at a tasting, and he and I hit it off. He said, you know, I need some help in my winery. Maybe you'd like to come up and help me on the weekends. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So basically, I spent my weekends and vacations from 1972 to 1976 with Joe Swan, learning winemaking. His consultant and best friend was Andrei Chelichev. So I really got the tutelage of a lot of really good people. Made my first wines in 1976, made a whopping 327 cases of wine, pretty much like I made this wine. My first wines were vineyard designated wines. I started making Zinfandel, one, because I tasted some samples that were like unbelievable. Joe Swan's 1968 is memorable to this day. It's unbelievable wine. And I've tasted others that were quite good. But Zinfandel fascinated me because it was the most European grape in California. It was the only grape in California that had the same tradition that European grapes have. So if you go to Bordeaux, what do they grow? They grow Cabernet. If you go to Burgundy, what do they grow? They grow Pinot Noir. Why do they grow those? Because over a period of time, through trial and error, they found those were the best grapes to grow in those particular regions. And they codified it. We didn't codify it. But Zinfandel arrived in California with a bunch of other grapes and really rose to the top. And by Prohibition times, it was the dominant grape in California. By the 1880s, it was the dominant grape in California. So Zinfandel ended up being planted in lots of places. Some of those places weren't particularly good, but some of them were wonderful. So Zinfandel from old vines gets planted in really remarkable places. So you end up having the sense of terroir in Zinfandel, the same kind of sense of terroir that you have in Burgundy or Bordeaux. Grapes planted in the right place, reflecting the flavors of that place. So for me, that was really important, and that's what in part drew me to Zinfandel, other than the fact that it tasted really good. I kind of lived a long and interesting existence. You know, I worked 2 jobs for a long time. Really, it was a seat-of-the-pants startup. Ultimately, I ran into some great partners in 1979 who were really smarter than I was. But they had the good sense to just let me do what I wanted to do. And you know, we ultimately ended up coming up with things like No Wimpy Wines. We ended up getting a great logo from David Goines. All those things were really, really helpful. And we went through the 90s. By 1992, I was actually getting a salary. I could pretty much devote myself to the whole operation. But the 90s were like chaos. It was like things were just growing like mad. In 1983, I started a little thing called Vintners Blend Zinfandel, which at one point was probably the most consumed Zinfandel in the entire world. But I was working at Vinwood, and I was working at Louis Martini. I took over 2/3 of Louis Martini at one point to make a Vintners Blend. Plus, we were doing all this work in in redwood fermenters, you know, making our single vineyard wines. When we released the single vineyards, we'd have people lined up out the door for the release. It was quite amazing. It was like a really energized time for making wine. Slipped into the 2000s, and in 1999, my partners, who had gotten pretty old, had decided that it was time to get out. So they decided we'd go public. And I was actually a public winery from 1999 to 2001. And then in 2001, we got acquired by Constellation. We almost got acquired by Robert Mondavi. That was pretty good we got acquired by Constellation, because they later acquired Robert Mondavi, so we would have ended up there sooner or later. Anyway, so, you know, Constellation, wow, big organization. It is a big organization, but it's been really interesting. I've gotten to do things that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten to do. I've gotten to travel the world. I've gotten to proselytize for Zin in exotic places like Kuala Lumpur and Stockholm. Would you call that Stockholm Syndrome? Maybe. And I've gotten to make the wines that we want to make, and it's been pretty interesting. I am currently beginning a new project. I'm still doing Constellation, of course, and still doing Ravenswood, but I'm looking down the road. I'm 70 years old. I'm not quite as young as I used to be, and I decided that I'm going to start another little project called Once and Future. So once I had a little winery, in the future I'm going to have a little winery. So you can find those wines online. But it's, this is not working very well.
I would say not.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to talk about?
Yeah. I've only talked 8 minutes and 25 seconds, Doug. You got 11. Anyway, it's been a remarkable era for me. It's been a remarkable era for the wines of Zinfandel. I have watched this business change from a very small business to, which wasn't really a business. It was really kind of like you're making wines because you love to make wines, and you sell them if you can. And you know, there were no big Costco wasn't around, and you know Safeway wasn't around, and so we all kind of made it by selling wines to people and to independents and to restaurants. It was very, very interesting back in those days, and we're all kind of lucky to be here, I think, and to see the kind of the modern era with the bigger wineries and intermingled with little wineries, and see the divide between the artisanal wineries of the world and the larger wineries of the world, the consumer-driven wines of the world versus the winemaker-driven wines of the world. Very interesting to watch that, and it's unknown to me how that will all evolve at the end of the day. But there's no question that because Zinfandel is what it is, because it's kind of the wine of California, because it's the wine of terroir, it will have a place in that spectrum, in spite of the fact that we have the latest fancy grape, Pinot Noir, or Cabernet, or whatever it may be. Zinfandel will always be part of that. So I've only taken 10 minutes, Doug. I think you're up. And how did I? Yeah, I did. I started out with my wine. Yeah. Well, no, we don't have to taste it. You mean
see what I have to deal with?
You want to drink the wine too? Doug, sit down. You don't have to move. Grab your. So Doug, tell me, how did a military brat get into the wine business? Geez, you spent a little time traveling around early, didn't you?
I did. I was very, very fortunate. By the time I was in junior high school, I had the opportunity to travel around the world. Spent quite a bit of time in Asia with my parents, and it was quite an eye opener, but more so in the sense that the people that I got to meet, the experiences that I got to have, and the things that I was introduced to at a very young age. Sort of with that said, it was a number of years later, I wound up in San Diego in Point Loma. My father was Navy, and that's where he retired. And I'm sure there's some Navy brats out there and some other branches of the service, and Simplified, all of my bros out there, did a little of that.
But my friend, being in the military doesn't qualify you to be a vintner. San Diego to Paso Robles?
Well, the nice thing about being in the military is it teaches you how to drink anything that will go into a glass, So you have a lot of opportunity to gag down a lot of stuff, and with that in mind, kind of growing up with that in that environment, the first wine that I made, I was 16 years old. And it was just a generic red grape. A friend of mine, his parents had a grape arbor in their backyard. They're a Portuguese family. And I remember one year we decided that, there's a couple of us, we decided we'd make some wine. And we did. I got a 5-gallon Sparkless water bottle, and crushed up the grapes and stuck them in this bottle and sealed the cork and put it underground. With a little bit
Very
of
traditional.
Very traditional. And so that was my first experience, of course, at making wine. And bottom line is we drank every bit of it. We got sicker than dogs. We had great headaches and just barfed our guts out, but decided, I kind of like wine. This is not bad stuff, It didn't cost me that much to do it, so that was my intro there.
Well, I know that you perverted our children. You were a school teacher for a while, weren't you?
Right.
And you got tired. You had kids of your own, and you decided that San Diego wasn't a great place for them, so you were going to move them to someplace else. So you moved to
Paso Robles.
And what did you do when you were in Paso Robles?
We made wine. No,
actually, you sold real estate.
I was a realtor.
You did everything.
I was a realtor. I was a developer. I had a construction company. And this was back in the old days. I like to say kind of our hippie days. And we had moved to Paso in the early 80s, in 1982. And so one of our jobs was one of my jobs was this construction company. And we didn't use power tools. We just worked out in the country. And mostly we rebuilt barns and racked barns. And the name of our company was Rural Erections. And so, got to keep it out there, Joel. Come on.
No kidding. That goes right up with the posters that you pass out.
My nothing but Zin. I remember the first time you saw that, That disgusted look on your face. You've seen our Nothing But Zin poster?
Scantily clad women, come on, Doug.
And Joel's shaking his head, walking away, saying to himself, why didn't I think of that, goddammit?
Now you understand why he had to change his career.
Well, so Doug, you didn't stop with real estate. You ran into a guy who had a little winery going, and you kind of sort of decided to help him out, right?
I was invited over to a friend's, his name was Pat Wheeler, and he was a transplant from LA, tool and die maker, had about as much experience in the business as I did, and only he had started a couple of years prior. It was a little 100-case winery, commercial winery, bonded. And that was my first introduction. I was invited to help him with the bottling. You know, when
That was Tobias, right?
that was Tobias. And you know, when Joel talks, and you'll hear it from the other guys and from Carol, you know, a lot of the things that they've done over the years, a lot of us like to say, yeah, that's the way I used to do it, and I tried, and I had this, but one of the differences, you know, my first barrel, my very first barrel, was a blue plastic concentrate barrel. And that's how I kept my wine. My first oak barrel was a used whiskey barrel that I bought for about $5 and filled it halfway with water and left it in the sun for a year and drank what was in it along the way.
Yeah, you know, the big companies are now trying to imitate that. They're making bourbon-flavored Cabernet.
I hear ya.
Yeah, just like you were making back there, bourbon-flavored Zinfandel. You know, if only you'd known the marketing aspects of that.
We did it, you know, and Joel, we had gone into a community that had a history in wine. Zinfandel grapes had been introduced in the 1800s. One of my good neighbors right now is Larry Turley, who came down and picked up the old Pizzeni Ranch and has been able to maintain that and a lot of the history that they have kept in the area. But for me, you know, when I was introduced to Zinfandel the first time, I enjoyed it. It seemed like a pretty easy thing to do. You know, you just kind of squeezed it up and let it ferment and then pressed it and then gagged it down, you know.
Yeah, well, I always said you could never make a bad Zinfandel. If you picked it too early, you made this really wonderful picnic wine. If you picked it too late, you made a great late harvest. If you picked it just right, you kind of went, wow, am I good?
And nobody around you knew what they were doing, so they thought you were the pro from Dover, you know, like, this is not bad stuff.
So you started Peachy Canyon when?
We bonded Peachy Canyon in '88. Yeah, we started making wine under the Tobias label in '82. And fortunately, as we were getting into the Zin business, and because we wanted to specialize, we didn't have a lot of money. We couldn't buy a lot of different grapes. And we had a source, which was Benny Doozy, who offered grapes to me. He just said, you pay me when you can. This was an old dry farm.
Man, he was a trusting guy.
He was a great guy, you know, and Ridge and I shared the vineyard for many, many years, and we've since gone on to some others, but it was that first introduction. As we grew, we made different Zins from different vineyards because we realized that Zin had this unique character. You know, for many of us, we say, you know, Cab is Cab, and Chardonnay is Chardonnay, and Pinot is Pinot. And we know there's a lot of variation, but with Zinfandel, you go, this is one Zin, and you walk across the street, and here's another Zin, and see that one over there, that one that's, you know, trellised, and that's a different Zin, you know, and even though they may be the same clones, they can be uniquely different, taste uniquely different, and depending on how you make them, be wonderful and be exceptional and be something that you carry that flavor in your mind. You know, for years and years and years.
So you've really specialized in Zinfandel. You haven't done much else, right?
We do 24 different
Zinfandels?
No, we only do 9 different Zinfandels. But we have a bunch of different SKUs. You know, we love wine. I think what we do best is Zinfandel. It's a way for us to really express ourselves. Robert Hansen is here with me today. If you get a chance to meet him, he's quite a talent. He's been our winemaker now for a number of years, and one of the things that I discovered as I was, you know, growing and trying to build this, as this small company, as this little startup, as, you know, looking for bank financing, you know, all of the above, I had to go more into the marketing and sales side and build a staff that, you know, went along with my likes and was consistent in their skills and the quality of their wines, and that's how we've been able to grow it. And that's why we've stayed with Zin also, because of this sort of love for it.
Yeah, you managed to convince your children that the wine business was a good thing, and they went out and almost did you one better.
They did me one better. They started their own label and they already sold the son of a gun. You know? And I'm going, dude, I'm 70 and I'm not retired. You guys just hit 40. What's the deal here?
So, well, you know, if you'd named it, what did they call it? They had chronic sellers. Like, you ended up at Peachy Canyon. I mean, like, really. I mean, you know.
I mean, can you imagine somebody coming to you, one of your kids, and saying, hey, Dad, yeah, Jake and I got this idea. We'd like to start our own label. You go, right on, kids. You know, hang in there. I love it. You know, and you want to be a part of it. And I said, well, what's the name? They go, well, we want to call it Chronic Cellars. I go, are you out of your goddamn mind? You know? It's like, who's dying? What's the deal? And they go, oh, okay, Dad, we get it. So, and then their biggest seller, of course, has been the Sofa King Bueno. Which is a blend. It's got some Zin in there.
Got some Zin in there, yeah.
And it's good stuff.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
So,
That's fantastic.
And they'll be back with Peachy. I think Peachy is generational. We have our grandchildren. Nancy and I would love to see them involved. Both of our boys are looking forward down the road when their contract is up, coming back to Peachy Canyon, making Peachy Canyon better. Continuing to have it as one of the dominant Zin producers on the Central Coast. And I gotta tell you, it's really, really a thrill to be able to be with this group of individuals who I've been making wine with for many, many years, and to have Peachy Canyon and Paso Robles is considered, one of the premier Zin producing areas around.
So quickly, tell us about 2 wines.
I got 2 wines for you. I got, the first one here is this is my 07 Snow Vineyard. And Snow is one of our estate vineyards. I own 4 vineyards. And this was about 25-year-old vines, head pruned, non-irrigated, on the west side of Paso Robles, considered to be in the Adelaida, even though it is not in the Adelaida. Our AVA system is kind of goofy down in Paso Robles, and I'll be happy to talk to anybody about it, how I feel it should have been.
Not now, it's too complicated, it'll take too long.
Pretty crazy, but I think the Snow is, we have since pulled the Snow Vineyard. We've given it a couple of years to go fallow. These rains have just been a blessing, just leaching all of this junk out of the soil, and salts are going away, and now we're getting ready to replant Snow. So it's been a real solid wine for us. Low yield, like all of your non-irrigated grapes, and I think that the fruit is holding up very, very well. The other wine that I decided to bring today is one that has been very, very popular for us, and that's the Bailey. It used to be, when it was David's father's vineyard next door, we called it Old Bailey because I didn't like him, and even though I got his fruit, but that's a whole different story. So David has been growing for us for a number of years now. This is a wine that I think shows a lot of varietal character. It's got some beautiful depth to it. Some spice, a little white pepper in there, and it's really one of my favorites. It's a go-to for me, and like all of our Zins, I think it's shown incredibly well. It's got some very nice reviews, and it's one that you want to hang on to because in Paso Robles, and I can generalize, and I'm going to generalize about the industry as my close. We're going to see this is a wine that we can retail for under $40. Bailey is a wine that is going to sell for about $90 in the next few years when some joker comes along with more money than brains and says, well, I'll give you $8,000 a ton for that because I don't have to make a living at it. I don't care too much about Beckett. So we're going to see some changes coming here. We're going to see some competition. We're hoping, all of us, that our growers will stick with us, that everybody can make a decent living and a good living. But I think some times are changing. And so keep an eye out for those great Zins, and thank you all for being here.
Doug, thank you very much. Great wines. Those Paso wines really speak Paso. They have that kind of like energy and the earthiness that comes from Paso. Very, very classy. Good job, my friend. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Matt Cline, man, another guy from L.A. It's our another boy who ended up. Wow. So how in the world did you end up in Contra Costa? Matt has spent nearly his entire career working out of a location that most of us didn't hear about very early, and then we heard about later, and that was Contra Costa. It turns out that it's an amazing place with unrooted vines, sandy soils. So, Matt, how did you end up in Contra Costa?
Well, first I want to thank Joel for inviting me to this panel. I've been on wine geek panels before, but I've never been on a wine geezer panel.
Speak for yourself.
But No, my introduction to wine was, when I finally hit my double-digit years, my grandfather put, I was 10 years old. My grandfather put a little wine in my water glass. And my mom was raised on a subsistence farm in Contra Costa, right next to these old vines. And she was raised on a subsistence farm, and my grandfather made wine for the table. Of course, through growing up in Southern California, I only had a chance to spend the summers, a couple weeks every summer, visiting cousins. And so those little water drops in the water glass turned out to be sneaking into my grandfather's cellar with my cousins, and
So is that what you were doing in that picture with that young child of yours? Were you sneaking water into her glass a little bit earlier than you got to it?
Actually, that's about a third into my career, At any rate, I got through those early years of my wine introduction, and
You were living in L.A. at the time,
Right.
And you and your brother Fred, kind of like was Fred. Fred was kind of an ornery fellow, wasn't he?
yeah, my parents had to send him to the farm, so to speak, because he was spending, out of 180 days of a school year, he was probably spending about 175 of them on the beach. Surfing. He was a surfer.
So instead, they sent him to Paso Robles, where it was all beach but no ocean.
Well, Contra, yep. And actually, the agriculture, he loved working with my grandfather. He made some wines with him in the old redwood fermenters. He started Cline bonded it in 1982. I was helping him all along. I was at the time going to school at Berkeley. And spent a lot of time out with him. And
Yeah, and you got your degree in an interesting subject.
well, I got a BS degree in entomology.
Entomology. So you studied bugs.
Yep. And so I figured my choice was as a career was either to advance my degree and study them and or kill them. But
So you became a vineyardist and you decided to kill him, huh?
Well, I didn't. Well, I wasn't smart enough to become a PhD, so I went to Davis and worked on another BS degree, and so I took over the winemaking for Cline in '85, and I had to totally wholesale change what my brother was doing because he was still doing it the old way, and that first year in '85, we actually bottled only 300 cases under the Cline label. That's where it started. Just from there, we got a 90-point score from Robert Parker and our
Those
production.
Robert Parker scores, weren't they wonderful when they happened? Yeah. They changed your life. A writer could change your life in those days. These days it doesn't happen quite the same way, but boy, Robert Parker was a power.
Yeah, no, my brother couldn't sell, he could only sell a case at a time. After that score, we were selling pallets at a time.
Yeah,
and that's a lot easier.
The first time somebody said, I want to order a pallet of wine, I said, what's a pallet? Yeah, so you guys kind of started out with those kind of Contra Costa wines, and then you kind of began with a larger volume one, kind of like I did. You needed a cash flow one to keep yourself going.
No? It took, it started at 300 cases, it took us 16 years to get to 300,000. But, we were still struggling with money. We literally started with our inheritance from the sale of, some of you know that my mom's maiden name is Jacuzzi. Her father, my grandfather, and his brothers started the corporation that ultimately in the early 60s, late 50s, developed the Whirlpool Spa. Mm-hmm. And so when that sold to a British corporation in 1976, it sold for like $76 million, which it was an international corporation. And so we were able to start our business on that. But by the time the inheritance got to us, we were a large Catholic Italian-based family. It was $12,000.
Sounds like a Napoleonic code to me.
But after getting out of spending my time at Davis, I worked in the Napa Valley for 4.5 years while we were kind of gradually building up steam at Cline. And I also had a chance to work with some great winemakers. Andrei Chelichev was a consultant at the winery that I was working for, and I learned certainly a lot from him. But it's these vineyards in Oakley that really taught me the most, and just the school of hard knocks.
So you dwelled on Oakley. Did you own property out there? You had some really famous vineyards out there, things like Big Break and Live Oak and some others. And I think you were really one of the only. Yeah, there are other people that are focusing out there now, but like you were there early. I mean, when it was only Gallo and some of the other big boys were pulling wine out of there.
Gallo wasn't at the time. That time, early time, it was mainly Sebastiani that was getting a lot of fruit, but the fruit was still being shipped to home, the fresh market, to home winemakers. So they still were, Frank Evangelo had his label, and he would harvest grapes and put them in the traditional wooden 32-pound boxes and palletize them up and ship them to all the produce markets in Chicago, Vancouver, New York, which was kind of what saved the viticulture industry once Prohibition was enacted.
Yeah, well, Prohibition, and most of the vines out there were planted before Prohibition.
Yeah.
And many of them are on their own roots, so they look different, don't they?
Well, they're traditional head trained or goblet trained. The head is really fairly close to the sand, and the sand is Delhi sand. It's basically river sand blown into sand dunes,
Right.
and so they're flux-resistant
Right.
soils. They were planted. Most of them were planted in the mid-1880s, which was a time that was was a kind of an outlier time because essentially it was about 6-7 years after the railroad was connected, and so California was booming. By the mid-1880s, there was a lot of income being created, a lot of wealth, and these vineyards were literally some of the first production vineyards planted.
By the end of the 1880s, of course, we went into a big recession. I've always been amused because the people who planted out there were farming in an area that was so sandy that they became known as sandlappers. One presumes that they had a lot of sand in their lap, and they grew things, not only grapes, but they grew something known as sandcots, which were apricots, sandy apricots. So it's a pretty interesting historical area. But they planted those vineyards, and they used a lot of different grapes when they were planted. Really, but they were pretty consistent in what they planted. What kind of grape varieties were they planting out there, Matt?
At this early time, when we had to decide what to plant all of California with, the three varieties that clearly rose to the top were Zinfandel, Carignan, and Mataro. And statistically, 100 years ago, Mataro was still 30% of all the red wine grapes planted in California. Carignan was even a little bit more.
Mataro is also known as Mourvèdre in France and Monastrell in Spain. So it's got multiple names, but when it came to California, it got called Mataro.
It was, a lot of the early budwood was being shipped out of the port of Mataro, which is near Barcelona. It's at the French-Spanish border. And I assume that, and other people assume that, this budwood was received by Portuguese and Italians on this side of the world and said, heck, I'm not going to give any credit to the French or the Spaniards. So, it was obviously that Mataro was, port of Mataro was on the export documentation of this budwood.
So you've approached this in a way that's a little, not so much unique, but it's a more traditional way. When you make your wine, you're doing blends of these grapes. Is that true, or that's the way you've ultimately evolved in your thinking about wine?
Well, these vineyards are, in my opinion, are kind of our last map, what we were doing before the feds got involved and basically screwed everything up for us, with the Volstead Act in
Yeah.
1920.
Yeah, and then the 75% rule.
Well, yeah, and that started at 51 in the 50s and gradually got up to 75, totally arbitrary numbers.
Yeah.
So these vineyards really kind of, I've gained unbelievable appreciation for them because what they represent. I mean, besides we were lucky enough to be in one of the most awesome microclimates and soil types to grow these type of varietals. As with a lot of old vine Zinfandel that's grown in California, there's rogue vines in there. I mean, these growers, when they were planted, there was no nursery to go to and buy some Zinfandel vines to replace vines that were mortality. And so they always made their own cuttings and replaced them with whatever they had.
Colonel Massal. So you got 2 wines here? These are blends.
Yeah.
So which wines are these, Matt?
Well, we have both our 2013 wines. We have our Live Oak Zinfandel, which is in this vintage is about 127-year-old vines. There's some, of course, Mataro, Carignan, Alicante Boucher, a little Black Malvoisie, micro amounts of that, which is the California synonym for Cinsault or Malvasia. I'm not a total. One of the things that I've added to my wine knowledge or my blending is that their Petit Syrah was not a variety that was planted in this area. It was established a lot by mostly Portuguese, and it was the Italians that brought and propagated Petit Syrah. But Petit Syrah, adds a lot to a blend, and so Petit Syrah has been introduced into Oakley in the last 25 years, and so that's also in this blend.
These are really delicious ones. You get to have the really nice fine tannin structure and that kind of rosy fruit character that you get out of the Oakley area. Those they have warm days, but they have very windy afternoons, so it cools off very quickly. So surprisingly, the acidities stay up, and you get a freshness out of the grapes, which I think is really terrific. Matt, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, great talking to you. Thanks for being one of us.
Thank you, Joe.
One of the geezers, my friend. All right. So that's the first 3. We got 3 more coming up.